Okay, great. Welcome everyone to Disciplines 101. This is part of the Seacoast, the collaboratory for studying coastal communities over space and time. And the purpose of Disciplines 101, just to remind everyone, is really to collect scholars together who are in different fields and can educate each other about key ideas from their disciplines, whether those are conceptual frameworks and theories, methods, or particular topics that they work on that are relevant to the coastal system and the communities of people who live in the coastal zone. And so today, we're really pleased to have two colleagues here at Duke. Norbert Wilson is a professor in both the Divinity School and in the Sanford School of Public Policy. Norbert is an applied economist who has a PhD from UC Davis and a background in agricultural economics. And over the course of his career, his interests have moved increasingly into areas of food security and issues of food justice. And so if you're wondering how an agricultural economist ended up in a divinity school, it's exactly that nexus, the idea that Norbert is actually working very much on issues related to the ethics surrounding our food choices and food security, and how that's tied to the underlying economics. Our second speaker today is Grant Murray. Grant is an associate professor in the Nicholas School in the same division that I'm in the Marine Science and Conservation Division. Grant has a PhD from University of Michigan and is an expert in marine policy. Grant works across a number of social sciences, drawing heavily on methods and ideas coming from anthropology, political ecology, and sociology. And Grant is also someone who works methodologically, both in qualitative and quantitative methods. And I'm not even sure which of those we'll be seeing today, but it's a real pleasure to have Grant here as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Norbert. If you can go ahead and share your screen if you have slides, take it away. Really happy to have you both here.
Great. Thank you so much, Marty. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's going to take just a second so that I can share screen, and I will better do it this way. I'll do it this way. After teaching online and doing other things, you would think I would have all of this under control, and just a second, folks. Thank you all for your patience. Tell me, can you see my slides?
We are seeing the presenter view. Oh, there we go. Yeah, okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
So it's on the setup slide.
Oops, sorry.
That's all right.
Don't. Oh my goodness, you would think. I'm so sorry about that. Thank you all. Thank you for your patience with me, and I will do my best to stay within 20 to 25 minutes. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share with you all. I was looking back at the email that Marty sent and the interest in coastal areas, and so I realized that my presentation will be a little bit different. I'm not going to speak specifically about coastal areas, but the more I've thought about some of the work that I'm doing and how it relates to the communities where you all work, food security, especially in North Carolina, is a particular challenge. And you cannot talk about food security in the United States and in North Carolina particularly without dealing with issues of race. And so today I want to share with you some of the work that I've been doing over the last few years with a number of different collaborators, and trying to think through what does food security look like here in this country, what are some of the policies that may shape food security, and then actually to spend a little time listening to the people who are experiencing food insecurity in this country. I should say, it was funny when Marty mentioned Grant's work, where he goes in between quantitative and qualitative work, and I'm an economist who's actually worked with a couple of qualitative researchers, and I'm excited to share some of that work, and some of that work has actually just been accepted, and I'll share a little bit of that at the end of my presentation. So Marty, you gave one of the best explanations of how I fit as an agricultural economist in a divinity school. So I'm glad this is recorded because I'll be using that. I think it's always important to talk about context. We are people of places, and we have identities that shape how we see the world and how we understand ourselves, and it influences our work. And so I think it's important for me to share with you a little bit about my home. I'm originally from Georgia. I grew up in a rural county called Terrell County, and I'll show you a graphic of it, in the southwest corner of the state. I actually was just home for a family funeral, and it was while loss is always difficult, it was good to be home with family, especially given COVID. But my home county is one of the counties that is right here, that is one of the more food insecure communities or counties in the state. These data come from Feeding America. They take the national statistics of food insecurity, which is just a measure of the challenge that families, households face when accessing food. And they use that national and state specific number, and then they make adjustments for a county level prediction of what food insecurity may look like. And again, this is my home county where we show that in 2018, 2019, food insecurity in my home county was 21%, 20%. And at the national average at that point, it was about 11 to 10% at the time. So double the national food insecurity rate at the time. I think it's important also to talk about what that means for a state like North Carolina, where the darker colors represent counties that are more food insecure given the socioeconomic status of households in those counties. And you can see that a number of those counties are also along the coastal region of the state, suggesting that there are greater rates of food insecurity or a higher prevalence of food insecurity in those communities. And I think this is particularly important for North Carolina, given that obviously we're talking about coastal communities and the challenges that they may face. It is interesting when you look at the national map, when you see food insecurity along other coastal regions of the US, you don't see the same level of, or the same disparity of food insecurity along coastal regions. And I would be intrigued to have conversations with you all to think about some of the economic conditions of those communities. I would imagine that those are communities that may have, because they're beach communities, they may have high rates of or high numbers of individuals with wealth and resources relative to maybe the state of North Carolina. But that's a conversation I would be intrigued to have with you all. I just want to show you what food insecurities look like over time in the United States. And I'm particularly showing you an old graph because I want to talk about 2020 because something very surprising happened. And you can see this top blue line is the rate of food insecurity. The orange line represents food insecurity with very low food insecurity. Many years ago, the USDA would call that food insecurity with hunger. They no longer use the term hunger. And you can see that during economic downturns, during the Great Recession, there was a big spike in food insecurity, but it actually took much longer for the food insecurity rate to get back down to pre-recession periods. And this suggested that there were going to be real challenges given the current COVID-19 pandemic and the economic implications of the pandemic. This is an important graph that I'm going to make some reference to again later in different forms. This is the food insecurity rate by racial groups. And the top blue line represents African-American or Black households, non-Hispanic. The orange line represents Hispanic or Latinx households. And you can see there's a huge difference in the food insecurity rate by racial and ethnic background. And this is something that really motivates the work that I'm doing. This is a graphic. It's a little bit old now. And I say that because of something I'm going to show you in just a moment. And this was in the sort of the summer of the pandemic of 2020. The US government started collecting data through this household pulse survey, and they asked a different question or set of questions concerning food security, and they call it food sufficiency. And so what they were looking at was food sufficiency for households with children. And this is a report from the Brookings Institute. And the concern is the one that I've raised earlier, is that once we get into the pandemic, you should see, or there was a prediction and there was estimates that food insecurity rates would be substantially higher across the board, but particularly for households that are from racial and ethnic backgrounds, so Black and Hispanic households. Estimates of food sufficiency, again, a slight change in the definition. It's a slightly different method of calculating sort of concerns about food. The evidence was suggesting that food sufficiency was going to be a greater problem for African American and Hispanic households, but it was going to be much higher or much worse, if you will, across the board. But then the national data came in, and I actually was giving a presentation when USDA, when the press releases came out about what food insecurity looked like in 2020. And lo and behold, food insecurity actually held flat from 2019 to 2020. It was a really big surprise for a number of people who work in this area, and a number of people justified the flattening out of food insecurity from 2019 was because of the number of policy implements that went in place during the pandemic, from the CARES Act to insurance benefits to child tax credits. So a number of things may have helped support families during the pandemic, and it does point to the importance of government support to support families during difficult times, especially when it's systemic, when numbers of people are experiencing that. Despite the positive outcome of, if you will, a flat food insecurity rate from 2019 to 2020, actually disparities increased. And forgive me for showing you a relatively busy chart, but I want to just draw your attention to this top blue line represents households that are food insecure in the United States. It was 10.5%, in the previous year was, I think, 10.1. And I should have double checked that, but there was no statistical difference between 2019 and 2020. But when we look at food insecurity by racial groups, we see white households had a food insecurity rate of 7.1%. Black households were 3 times as food insecure as their white counterparts at 21%, almost 22%. And the Hispanic households were double the white household food insecurity rate. And I could actually just call it a day there and say, this is a real problem that needs adjustment. There is something significant going on. Now, I will say that because of the pandemic, because of the racial reckoning that we have been dealing with over the last few years, there's been a lot of interest and attention turned toward issues of race, and it comes to issues of course, food security. And I would say, even just professionally, there was a time when people would argue, when you take into consideration household characteristics, number of people in the household, education, income, that the food insecurity rate wouldn't be really any different for white versus Black households or Hispanic households. But these data suggest that maybe there's something more going on. In essence, there is this racial disparity, and it has been perennially high. And I want to take a moment to look at some of these differences. And I realize I'm looking at it, I'm about 10 minutes in, and so I'm going to be careful to move through this quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for conversation and for Grant. And there are a couple of areas that I think are important for us to consider. One, this disparity of food insecurity or food security. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I talk about scarcity and how households are dealing with it, but I won't spend as much time there. And I do want to talk very briefly about some of the qualitative work that I've been doing around how households are dealing with and how communities are providing support. It's actually an interesting example of resilience that we see in communities in addressing food insecurity. So this is a paper that some colleagues and I published back in 2018 related to just looking at the disparity of food insecurity by racial and ethnic groups. And so what we are going to do, what we did rather in this paper is we looked at both the incidence, sort of whether or not a household was food insecure. And typically when you see reports of food insecurity in the United States, it's whether or not a household is food insecure or not, versus looking at the severity. So once you're deemed food insecure, how food insecure are you? And that's an important thing that often is overlooked in many of the national statistics. And we look at this over the Great Recession, because as you remember, that big bump that occurred during the Great Recession was an important moment for consideration. And one of the things we also take into consideration is the role that SNAP, the food stamp program, plays. And so we use the Oaxaca blinder decomposition method. Because of my time, I'm going to move through this quickly. We're using data from the federal government, the current population survey. These are the data that the USDA uses to report food insecurity. And we look at a group of time periods before the pandemic, before the recession, the Great Recession, during the Great Recession, and then immediately after. And so this top graph represents the food insecurity rate differences using just the raw data. So not estimates, it's just what the differences are. And we also look at it for immigrant versus non-immigrant households. And so what we're going to be doing in a moment is looking at the difference when we take into consideration the Oaxaca blinder decomposition, where we're going to show once we control for those household characteristics and when we even use controls for SNAP participation because of the endogeneity, we're going to look at those differences. And so what we can see in terms of the severity, the incidence, whether or not a household is food insecure, there are big gaps in food insecurity for Black versus white households, for Hispanic versus white households, and even immigrant versus non-immigrant households, where immigrant households are more food insecure in terms of incidence. But when we look at severity, so like how food insecure those households are, the differences for Black and white households actually remains, but for the severity for Hispanic and white, and actually immigrant and non-immigrant, it goes in reverse. So when we take into consideration the decomposition, we can see that there are factors that have nothing to do with sort of household size. There's sort of this unexplained component that's the major driver for food insecurity differences for Black versus white households. That difference is sort of split for Hispanic versus white households in terms of incidence, and it is in reverse when we look at immigrant versus non-immigrant households. And this is also including the SNAP participation, when we use an instrumental variable approach to look at the difference of SNAP. One of the things that's really important to understand is that we see that there are these differences in food insecurity by instance, and the severity seems to go a little different, but it's still stronger for Black households versus white households. And the important thing is that when we control for these unobserved characteristics, this difference still persists. And SNAP, a program that's supposed to help reduce food insecurity, which it actually does on an aggregate basis, doesn't get rid of the inequality or the disparity of food insecurity by household types. And I think this is a really important point. And it shouldn't be considered a bad outcome of SNAP. SNAP was not created to reduce disparities. It was created to reduce food insecurity in aggregate. And so it does a good job of doing that. And yet there are many researchers who argue and many advocates who say SNAP needs to do better. But one of the things that we realize is SNAP is not reducing that disparity. And that encouraged us to look at this other paper. And what we do is use simulations to look at the difference of food insecurity. And we try to understand how we could manipulate the SNAP program to actually reduce some of the gaps in food insecurity by changing different aspects of how SNAP is distributed. And so we look at the pathways through which SNAP impacts the inequality and exposure to food insecurity by these different racial and ethnic groups. And we try to manipulate changes in the SNAP policy through simulations to actually reduce that disparity. I should give you a heads up. This is an interesting body of work because the Biden administration back in August actually implemented a big shift in the SNAP program in terms of the amount of money that was given out, if you will, the generosity, which I'll talk about in a moment. And one of the ways they increased the generosity so as to actually hopefully help reduce food insecurity. And one of the things that'll be interesting to see is what happens to the disparities associated with food insecurity. I realize to make sure I get through all of my major points, I'm going to move through a couple of things a little bit more quickly than I would have otherwise. One of the two core ways that we wanted to think about of the three of how to actually change the SNAP program to reduce the disparity is we want to think about this idea of eligibility. SNAP is a program where if you are 185% of the federal poverty line and you meet a number of assets in terms of homes and other costs of living tests, you are eligible for for SNAP benefits. We also wanted to look at participation. Just because a household is eligible doesn't mean that they actually participate. And we see participation rates that are less than between 40 to 60%, depending on household types. So there is a gap in whether or not a household participates or remains in the SNAP program over time. And then we also wanted to take into consideration generosity. And that is simply to say that how much money the SNAP program grants to individuals who participate who are also eligible. And so what we want to do is link these differences in the SNAP benefits to differences in household consumption as a way of saying, once you're eligible for SNAP, once you participate and there's an amount of money, the way SNAP shows up is it grants money to households to buy food. And the question is, does that money, or is that money large enough to reduce the gap of food insecurity that we observe in terms of the needs stated by households in terms of what they need to meet their food needs relative between different household types. So I see that I am a little bit out of time. I'm going to skip my setup. Suffice it to say that we run this simulation by looking at eligibility, where we say whether or not a household is likely to be eligible. Once they're eligible, whether or not they participate, and once they participate, how much money they actually receive. I'm going to skip a number of slides. I'm so sorry, y'all. I should have planned this a little bit better. I'll just get to the descriptive statistics. And what we look at are the shares of households by racial group that are eligible. And we can see that from the data, 25% of white households are eligible, 43% of Black households are eligible, and 44% of Hispanic households are eligible. We can see there are differences in the participation rate of those that are eligible. And then we can see some differences, and this is just from the data, what people are saying that their benefits are. Excuse me, these are imputed, forgive me. These are imputed rates. These are the self-reported rates. And the important thing is that there is a gap that should occur because of the greater need that African-American or Black households have and Hispanic households have relative to their white households. The real challenge is what we see is that Black and Hispanic households have greater benefits, but their needs are greater in terms of what they report as the money necessary to meet their household food needs. I'm just going to go ahead and skip to the results because I am short on time. So here are some of the main findings. We found that there's some universal eligibility increases SNAP benefits for Black households relative to white households the most. So if we were able to actually increase the opportunity for eligibility, Black households would actually see a reduction in the disparity between Black and white households. That reduction in disparity wouldn't completely eliminate the difference, but it would actually reduce the difference. So automatic enrollment increases SNAP benefits for Hispanic households relative to white households the most. So instead of eligibility, it's whether or not Hispanic households participate in the SNAP program when they're considered eligible. That's what drives the reduction in the difference. This constant transfer policy with slightly lower SNAP benefits for Black households relative to white households and lower SNAP benefits for Hispanic versus white households by half. In short, there can be manipulations of the SNAP program as we know it today that can actually help reduce some of the disparities. Again, this is a simulation model based on data from previous years. It's going to be interesting to see what the major change in the SNAP program that occurred in August will do to food insecurity rates in 2021, but more importantly in 2022, as we look at a full template of policies that have been implemented by the Biden administration to hopefully reduce some of the disparities. So I think we should watch this as we move forward. I realize I'm going to pass on this. I'll just give you this small example of how different households have been able to deal with the food insecurity rates and challenges of the pandemic. As many of you know, the pandemic has really fundamentally shaped how individuals were able to meet their food needs. Back in March of 2020, we all experienced the uncertainty of going to grocery stores and seeing empty shelves. But for individuals who were struggling with food security, how they were able to access food was significantly affected because not only were they facing difficulties in grocery stores, Many of these individuals are also participants in the charitable food sector. So using opportunities where churches and other nonprofit organizations provide free food through pantries, through congregate feeding programs or soup kitchens, as we commonly call them. And it became difficult to access those programs. Feeding America, the broad organization that supports many of the food banks and their pantries throughout the US, really stepped up and did a lot of work, but the way that many pantries were able to give food and how they gave food actually was changed. So a number of individuals found creative ways of meeting food needs through examples, as you can see in the pictures here, where they used something like little free libraries. They converted them into little micro pantries, and they showed up throughout the US. And some of these existed before the pandemic, but many communities found this as an important way of meeting food needs in their communities. And so one of the things that some colleagues at Tufts University and I did was we conducted a series of interviews with the stakeholders, the individuals who help create and manage these little free pantries, and also individuals who participate in these little free pantries. And one of the things that really struck us about this innovative way of meeting food needs was how it actually reduced many of the barriers that individuals face when trying to meet food needs through food pantries that are very common, where anonymity and security were allowed in different ways, where food pantries may only are open only certain times of the day and only certain days of the week. These little micro pantries actually provided really quick and easy and anonymous ways that were open 24/7 for individuals to meet their food needs. It also created a sense of community for both the people who took food and sometimes who gave food, and for the stakeholders, the organizers of these micro pantries. And so what we found was an innovative way of people helping their community members outside of large regulatory systems like Feeding America typically uses to meet food needs in local and actually pretty resilient ways. One of the things that I took away from all of this work is food insecurity is a real challenge in our country. It is actually racialized, and in order to meet those needs, there is a role for public policy to address not only the aggregate problem, but also the disparities of this problem. Communities have found innovative ways of meeting those food needs, but there is much more work needed to address those challenges. I'll end by saying one of the things I've learned since being at Duke University is I've had the opportunity of working with pastors, because I am at a divinity school, and learned about some of the churches that actually engaged in some of these micro pantries. And I learned about a coastal community, and I'll keep it nameless at this point. There was a coastal community where a pastor was working there, and one of the things I learned about the challenge of North Carolina's coastal communities, or at least the one that this person worked, was while there's a great tourist industry, many of the locals were struggling to meet food needs and had challenges with housing. And they were finding innovations like these micro pantries, like feeding programs in their churches to meet some of their needs. And so I hope as an organization, as a group of researchers, you all begin thinking about some of the challenges in coastal North Carolina in meeting food needs of community members, especially given racial and ethnic differences. Thank you all so much. I appreciate this time.
Thank you, Norbert. We have a couple minutes for questions. I didn't see any in the chat, but I know Marty has a question. Marty, if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Norbert. That was really fantastic. And there's really a lot to think about there. And throughout your presentation, I kept trying to think about place and the coastal communities. And so I don't know if you can answer these questions based on the data that you've been working with, but I'm wondering to what extent the disparities, the racial disparities in food insecurity are similar in both rural and urban areas, or very different, and to what extent we know about that, and also how the particular challenges of using SNAP benefits may be different in rural areas. And of course, you know, we think about the coastal community has some urban areas, and we think about the fairly densely developed tourist areas, but many of the people living in coastal counties are living in rural areas, and certainly many of the minority populations. And so just, it's a tough question, I realize, but I wanted to see if we can turn it to a little bit of that, what your thoughts are.
Sure. Marty, these are really important issues that you're bringing up. So I'll take it in a broader sense, the challenge of rural versus urban areas and food insecurity. We see, I wouldn't even split it up that way. I'll even make it 3 areas. So rural, suburban, and urban. So food insecurity typically is worse in both the rural areas and in urban areas. Suburban areas tend to do better. And that's probably to do with wealth distribution and where people actually live in terms of their ability to earn a good living. So that's the first point. The second point is the way we try to address food insecurity for the most part is through federal programs like SNAP. And SNAP, because of the reduction of support through many of the traditional, if you will, welfare programs, were greatly affected through the 80s and 90s with reforms to welfare. And SNAP was one of the few programs that kind of sort of survived all of those cuts. And it provides an important way of meeting household needs, okay? But SNAP is a particular program because it's not just free money in a sense. It is money that is specific to using it in food retail settings. So you can then imagine that SNAP benefits can be a challenge if you live in communities where access to grocery stores are a challenge. And I think about some of the coastal regions. I was actually, because of this presentation, I was looking at some of the regions. I was like, oh my gosh, I bet there are not a lot of stores, and you may have to drive a pretty far distance. And this one person I knew was living on one of the islands, and it seemed like there might be a store there, but it wasn't always the case. So all that's to say, access to grocery stores is a really important thing for meeting those food needs. And so that's a particular challenge that I think rural communities face. Urban communities face that in a different way in terms of how do you navigate those urban spaces. If there's good public transportation, do you have access to a car? And you can think about a parent with children, the difficulties when you don't have a car in order to get access to the grocery store. So for all of those reasons, how we are able to meet those food needs can be challenged because of the location of where we are. The last thing I'll say, I'm sorry, I was going to make one more mention about this. Yes, so we live in a different age now. So if you'd asked me this question maybe 1.5 years ago, I would have said, and I'm careful talking about food deserts. That's a sort of a contested topic nowadays because there's more evidence to suggest that people are traveling distances to meet their food needs, but that doesn't mean it's costless for them to do that. That there are costs and it may have influenced their ability to meet their food needs. But the bigger point I want to raise is online grocery shopping has fundamentally changed the way we think about access to food. And there was a time where it was considered only sort of higher income households were participating in online grocery shopping. But because of the pandemic, the federal USDA has expanded the ability to use SNAP dollars on online grocery stores. So this expansion has played an important role of allowing individuals from lower income households to access online grocery shopping, in ways that they hadn't considered before. And that also has a benefit for individuals who are living in rural communities. Now, I'm actually on a qualitative project looking at qualitative and quantitative project looking at online grocery shopping. So this is something that's sort of front of mind right now. And there are some real interesting challenges of even rural communities accessing online grocery shopping. So there are movements ahead that may help reduce some of the disparities that I mentioned, but I don't think it's a problem that's not easily resolved. And we can go into a whole nother conversation about the challenge of online grocery shopping and how those platforms may be influencing food choice. I didn't even touch nutrition. We could go there. That's another conversation for another time.
All right, thanks for that, Norbert. We need to move on to Grant.
Thank you.
And if anyone has questions for Norbert, we might be able to have some, or we might have some time at the very end. So.
Great, so I'm gonna go ahead and try to share screen now, and hopefully it works. I came into the lab here to have better internet connection, and it seems to be worse here than it is at home. So my apologies if I glitch out, but I'll do my best. Okay, is everybody seeing my screen?
Yep, but yeah, go into
What grade
presenters
view?
mode. Uh, let's see, it's stuck, not in presenters view. There we go.
Good to go?
Yep.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks in advance to Marty and to the rest of the Seacoast team that had me come in here and talk today. I'm actually on the wrong slide here, so I'm just going to go back to the beginning. So I'm going to start off with a picture. Like Norbert, I talk a lot about, or think a lot about place in the kind of work that I do. And this is a picture that almost includes me, or the building that I'm talking to you from. This is the commercial fishing port in Beaufort, North Carolina, which I think most of you know where that is, on the southern Outer Banks. And the Marine Lab is just off to the screen left of this. So this is the place that I'm talking about. I'm talking about Beaufort in particular, but also the wider region around here. So, you know, in the spirit of this 101 idea, I wanted to begin talking about what we mean by culture. The topic of the talk, or the title of the talk that I provided, was about the cultural values associated with seafood. And I'm going to get into those specifics, but I want to zoom out a little bit by not offering a definition of culture. It's one of those terms that's sort of a broad umbrella term that is like an ecosystem or nature or sustainability. That the definition depends sometimes on who you talk to. And so I really like this way of thinking about culture. And this was a word cloud that a master's student put together. And that highlights some of the different things that culture means to different people. One of the things that's missing in this particular graphic is beliefs or knowledge. The study that she was doing this in was about beliefs and knowledge, so that wasn't included. But you can see many of the other things that we think about, or that I pay attention to as a scholar when we're thinking about culture: language and people and food and religion and customs and traditions, the things that we as a group share together and that inform what we mean to say that we're part of a group. When I talk on this today, I'm really going to be focusing on this center bit, values. So I'm going to say the word values a lot, but I want you to think about that when I talk about it in the context of this larger notion of culture. I'm also going to be talking about beliefs, which again is not part of this particular graphic. I won't belabor the idea of culture too much. I think we all basically know what it means, but I want to make 4 points that I'd like to ask you to keep in mind as I go through the talk. First is that culture is shared. That's something that exists among or between people, right? It's not something that is held purely individually. It exists in a social context and within a group. It's also fundamentally tied to place. So there's groups and there's places. So sometimes groups are not tied to those particular places, but often they are. So we're talking about groups and we're talking about places. It's profoundly tied to our well-being, meaning that a healthy culture tends to be associated with a healthy sense of well-being, right? That our well-being is higher. It shapes how we interact with the environment, right? The beliefs and traditions and values that we hold, the religions, the customs, the ethnicities, etc. All of those are associated with how we behave vis-a-vis the environment, how we understand the environment, what we think it is, the traditions that we associate with environmental interactions. It's profoundly tied to what we think is right about interacting with the environment. And it also mediates what changes we don't do or do not want to see. Right? Are they congruent with the traditions and beliefs and values and so on that are associated with culture? And so that has, I think, implications for what this Seacoast enterprise is about. Culture is shaping how we understand impact and change, and what kinds of changes we're likely to tolerate and what kinds of changes we're likely to resist. So I'm going to zoom in even further and talk about values and seafood. And first, I'm going to talk about seafood production. So the graphic here that you see is actually another part of the town that I live in Beaufort. This is about a mile down the road from my house. It's showing a place called Fisherman's Park. And in places like Beaufort and Down East communities, culture is all around us. There's material aspects of culture. There's buildings, there's architecture, there's art, there's memorials, like is what's shown in this picture, that highlight some of the values that we collectively hold to be true or to be valuable here on the coast. So this is a particular memorial to the Menhaden fishery. I won't make you read it off of this the actual picture of the monument. I took that and I put it into more easy to read text. And I think it's useful to look at things like material culture, at these emblems that we see every day as we go down, go for a walk out of the house, and look at the kind of values that are highlighted in a community like Beaufort. So I pulled out a few. So when we think about the values of a fishing community, the values associated with a place like Beaufort, where fishing is still present, has been part of the fabric of this place for generations. These are the kind of values, it's not all of them, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the kinds of values that we're talking about, that it's associated with livelihood. God is a big part of what we talk about in fishing traditions. Bravery and strength, toil and hard work. Searching, this idea of adventure and independence, right? Of searching and hunting for the prey, something that people value. Reading the ocean, right? That there's a knowledge associated with being a fisher, with being a harvester, with somebody that's interacted on the water for a long time. And that knowledge itself has values. Family and town, right? Families and traditions, and the tradition of fishing that's passed down from family to family. Fueling an industry, the idea that fishing is part of the economic engine, part of the economic fabric, not only socially, but economically of the town. And constancy, right? The idea that fishing has been there and will always be there, that it's something that's steadily true over time. So these are the kinds of values that I'm interested in when we're talking about production. I'm going to get more specific in a minute about some of those values and how we treat them in a research sense. But in this project, we're also interested not just in production. I'm going to be talking about a specific project in a minute. Not just in production, the values we associate with acts on the water or in communities immediately adjacent to fishing areas, but in consumption too. We have a lot of traditions, a lot of values, a lot of beliefs, a lot of actions that are associated with the consumption of seafood. So these are pictures of places in Morehead City, which is the next town over, talking about fresh local seafood and the Sanitary Restaurant. I put that one up there because I just think it's the funniest title for a seafood restaurant. I don't know why they thought that was a selling point, but anyway, it's a Sanitary Restaurant. Things like a Low Country Boil, that's the upper right-hand picture. Fresh oysters, right? Tasty oysters from North Carolina. These are all parts of traditions that we hold to be valuable. These traditions and values and the people that hold them are not necessarily in the same place as where production is taking place. Sometimes it is. Seafood's certainly eaten on the coast, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but it's not always the case. Our seafood products move from the coast into distant markets, sometimes across the world. But we're interested in the values that people are associating with consumption as well as production. So all of that is sort of preamble and explanation for how we come at the particular project that I'm going to talk about now. So the work I'm going to highlight now is a mixed methods approach. Marty was talking about my interest or split between qualitative and quantitative methods, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and including a study that involves a mixed methods approach that does both of the things at the same time. This is a Sea Grant funded project. Shout out to Sea Grant for funding this kind of work, and a shout out to my collaborators as well, Lisa Campbell here at the lab, Luke Fairbanks now down at the University of Southern Mississippi, Linda Diana at the Coastal Studies Institute and on the Outer Banks, Josh Stoll at the University of Maine, and then Robin Fail and Julia Bingham, who have been integral PhD students to the project so far. So one piece of big background that is fueling the interest in this particular project is change. So I talked a lot about the traditions and values associated with fishing, but the production of seafood, the way that seafood is produced, both in North Carolina and across the globe, is changing. Aquaculture as a percentage of overall seafood production is getting bigger and bigger. So this graph shows that trend over time. You'll see that at a global level, commercial fishing has more or less plateaued. There may be blips and ups and downs in particular stocks, but at a global level, we're not going to be extracting much more seafood out of the water from commercial fishing. We are going to be doing that if these trends continue from aquaculture. And so my interest as a social scientist is in what that means in terms of cultural values associated with seafood. What does that transition look like for the people that are experiencing that change, both as producers and as consumers? For those that don't know, North Carolina recently has been really pushing the growth of seafood, of aquaculture. And so they've anticipated a 10-fold increase over 10 years in shellfish production. The number of lease applications is shown here on your screen right, has gone dramatically up over the last 10 years or so. There's been a number of efforts from the state to streamline regulatory processes. Non-governmental actors have gotten in on the act to do things like create an oyster trail to attempt to anchor oyster consumption to tourism, to come up with a plan to combine aquaculture with reef restoration to get more oysters in the water for all the ecosystem services that they do. And they've tried to assemble a multi-stakeholder approach to furthering that industry. And that was captured in this strategic plan for shellfish mariculture, a vision to 2030. Again, I'm interested in what that means on the ground. So for those that have never seen an oyster farm, that's what it looks like here on the coast. The upper left inset is just a picture, a zoom in on what they call an oyster bag. Oyster bags float on the surface, so you can see them on the side there. There's floats, and in the middle is the bag. The different strings is what they call them, contain different sizes of oysters. They sort of graduate into a bigger bag with bigger mesh as they get bigger. And as they end up on one end of the farm, eventually, of course, they're harvested. They're year-round operations, and they produce fairly high-quality seafood. They're largely produced for the half-shell market, and they not always, but often gain a premium over wild-caught products. This is a bunch of students that we took out to the Morris Morris Oyster Farm, which is in Sea Level, North Carolina, part of the Down East communities. So, research question we're interested in: what values are associated with fishing and aquaculture in Eastern North Carolina? To do that, we had 3 different methods that we deployed. The first is a qualitative approach. The second is what's called Q-sort. And the third is what's called, or is involved, a statewide consumer survey with an N of about 1,100. So all of this is anchored on an extensive work on developing a qualitative database. That came from meeting minutes, from leasing applications, from different sources of public government interaction discussing oyster growth, from interviews that we conducted with oyster farmers and commercial fish harvesters and other residents of the coast, from working with our community partners here in the project, oral history archives that are warehoused by one of the community partners, about 500 different files. And I'm not going to go into that in great depth, other than to say that it all got organized into a single database. And from that, we extracted statements, ideas, bits of text that related to this notion of value and or belief. Right? We pulled quotes that represented the different values, the sort of universe of values related to, or hopefully approximating a universe of values related to both fishing and aquaculture, and to the tensions between those two. We then move this into what's called a Q-sort, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time explaining that because it's, I think, a different way of doing research, or we hope is a different way of doing research on these kinds of values. And basically what it does is involve taking that organized database of value statements and belief statements and boiling them down to, in our case, 48 different statements that literally get printed out on little cards like you see on the floor here. This is us in the formation stage of that. And each one of them contains a particular statement pulled directly from an interview, sometimes with some light editing to get rid of the ums and the ers and the things like that, but more or less exactly what somebody said in an interview. And they look like this. There's 48 of them. I can't, it would take us forever to go through all of them, but I'll give you a few of them to give you a sense of the kinds of things that people are saying when we ask them about values and attitudes associated with seafood. The particular statements I pulled out here are ones that sort of define this Q-sort, so keep that in mind, that these ended up being important statements that, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. First one, of course, is talking about shellfish mariculture being this win-win-win. It's a great idea, everybody should do it. Second one is almost counterpoint to that, saying, this is commercial fishing is a really important part of the heritage and tradition, passed down from generation to generation, et cetera. It's talking about fishing as part of the cultural fabric of the place. Third one talks about food security, so overlaps with that second one, but also particularly points to this notion of contributing to food security. Number 34, the fourth one on the slide, talks about the ecosystem service benefits, or some of them related to oyster farming. That's a big part of the argument for getting more oysters in the water. A few more. Some of them talk about beliefs about who should benefit from oyster mariculture growth. Should it be big corporations? Should it be people from out of state? Or should it be this idea of the mom and pop local operations? Third one down, I'll talk about a minute, is the idea that there's competition for space with oyster mariculture. That's been a point of conflict here, that if you put a farm in the water, that precludes other uses of that water. Can't swim there very easily, can't hunt there very easily. It changes the aesthetic impacts for some people. It changes how that space can be used. And then again, that last statement there kind of gets back to the same question about who should be benefiting from the growth of the industry. What we do then is ask people to arrange them in a formation that looks like this. On the far left, your screen left, is less like how I think. Those statements, I don't agree with that statement. That's not how I think about the world. On the other side, this is how I think about the world. These are the ones that resonate with me the most. The reason we do this is that some of these values and beliefs are really difficult to quantify or to monetize or to directly measure it, but it is sometimes possible to say, well, that one's more important or less important. And so we ask people to distribute them across this formation. You'll notice on the far left and the far right, they only get 2 slots. You have to be selective out of these 48 statements, which ones are really the most important or the least like how I think, and so on towards the undifferentiated middle. The middle are ones that people really don't react to strongly one way or the other. What this allows us to do then is to analyze similarities and patterns in how people arrange these statements. Are certain statements tending to be more to the right? Do they cluster together with other kinds of statements? Are there sort of example formations that we can highlight as being representative of larger groups of people? You can think about it as a factor analysis. What it looks like in practice is this. So this was a variety of different venues getting people together, and some in Raleigh, we were looking at a seafood market, down east communities, and a little bit of a close-up for what it looked like when 2 people were doing it head-to-head. We interview everybody afterwards to try to understand why they made the choices they did about the formations that they made. I'm not going to go into this part, other than to say that what we do is look for similarities in how the patterns are distributed. But what we end up with is 4 different perspectives that include multiple statements that tend to be important for people and that tend to be associated together, right? Either as ones they react negatively to, that's not how I think, or that they react positively to, that is how I think. And so we get 4 different sort of interpretations or understandings of what people think about this seafood transition. The titles at the top in bold there are our own sort of distillation of the theme of that statement that didn't emerge from the data. That's what we labeled them as to kind of keep them straight. The first one is pretty pro-aquaculture, right? The aquaculture community builder. But the reason for that is that aquaculture is seen as a way to keep coastal communities viable, right? That it contributes to the economy, it contributes jobs that'll keep kids in place. It's a balance with commercial fishing. The ultimate goal is oriented towards sort of community viability and community survival. The next one is like that, but it's an interesting variation in that they're pro-aquaculture in general, but the reason for that is more ecological. That the reason we should have more shellfish aquaculture in the water is because it does these positive ecosystem services, and there's an association that commercial fishing has some negative impacts. So aquaculture is a better way for these people of producing sustainable seafood protein than commercial fishing. And then the third one is a bit more negative on aquaculture. They don't reject it, they see a place for it, but in a very limited way, that it should be locally owned and it should be small scale. If it's not those things, then there's a threat to this backbone idea of commercial fishing, right? There's a threat to the idea of cultural continuity represented by commercial fishing. So it's a limited perspective on aquaculture. And then the next one is entirely anti-aquaculture. This is a belief that it's a threat. It's yet another threat to commercial fishing, that commercial fishers are already facing undue pressures from regulation and from market pressures, and this is just another problem that they're going to have to deal with, another threat to their livelihoods, to their market opportunities, and so on. So two pro perspectives on aquaculture and two kind of anti perspectives on aquaculture, but for somewhat different reasons. And that's one of the goals of this exercise, is to try to break apart simple jobs versus the environment dichotomies, to think about these beliefs and sort of value constructs around change in a somewhat more nuanced way. And probably a lot of residents can find something in these different perspectives that they find to be palatable, but they tend to be more centered with one or the other. Okay, so I'm going to move relatively quickly through the other part of what we did, which was a quantitative exercise. So remember, I focused on seafood production, which is largely what we used QSort to look at, talking to people in the place where seafood is produced. We're also interested in seafood consumption. This was a big statewide survey, a semi-random, I can explain in Q&A what I mean by that, semi-random survey of the entire state to look at the values that people associate with seafood. And again, we were interested in, well, what does that mean for the potential growth or the potential trajectory of shellfish aquaculture here in the state? So I've just pulled out a few, and I'm actually going to show you the questions, and then I'm going to pause for just a minute. I'm cognizant of my time, so I won't pause for too long. But I'm going to pause just for a second, and y'all think about how you would answer that question. These are the attributes that we included down below. They're in black bullets. For now, for ease of time or for in consideration of time, just think about which of those attributes of seafood are the most important to you when you go to purchase it. Can't have them all in this exercise. You got to pick which ones are the most important. Okay, I'm going to show you what the public in North Carolina thinks about that. The blue is more important. The dark blue, I should say, moving through the lighter shades of blue towards less important rankings associated with that. And so you see a lot of the attributes that are important, rated most importantly for consumers, have to do with what we call consumer-facing attributes. How it tastes and feels, the cost, the relative health risk, what it means for me as a consumer to eat it. The lower ranked ones are the ones that have to do with how it's produced, right? Where the form it's produced, whether it's sustainable, whether it's wild caught, whether or not it's good for local economies. It's kind of surprising to us to see how low local was on this when you look at it at a statewide level. So I'm going to give you another one. Bunch of species here that we included in the survey. Those are on the left. And then we were asked people to rank 1 through 5. Prefer farmed, prefer wild, or I don't care. And we asked that for each of those species. Just so you know, in the survey, if people indicated that didn't eat those species, they weren't asked this question. So this was questions that applied to people that did eat these species. So think about that. I'll show you the data. So here, the blue is a preference for wild caught. The gray is a no preference statement. I don't care. It's wild caught or farm. The green is a preference for farm products. And the yellow is I don't know. Right? So slightly difference there between I don't care and I don't know. Strong preference for wild. Interestingly, cuts across all species, some of which are not farmed. So there's a kind of non-differentiation in answering that cuts across different species. One last one that I'll share here, or actually I've got two more. Do you associate the following attributes more with farmed or wild products? So this was trying to combine that first question, what attributes are desirable, with the second question, farmed or wild provenance or form of production. Do these different attributes associate more with being farmed or with being wild? And this is what we find. So the blue is more associated with wild caught. The green is more associated with farm raised. The other colors are more neutral or not associated with either. So some of them are more associated with farm raised products, like ease of access and affordability, and by a slight margin, sustainability. Some are more associated with caught products, including some of the most important ones. And so we're very interested in that. What is it about wildness that people are gravitating towards? Is it a proxy? Is that term a proxy for some other set of attributes that people are actually concerned about? Is it something about the notion of wildness itself that people are interested in? Don't have answers for that yet. Last slide, prediction. We asked demographic questions of the respondents and put it to you, which ones you think might be relevant to those trends. The answer is only this one. So none of that other demographic measure is statistically associated with how people tend to answer about farmed, wild, and what they prefer in terms of attributes. But where they live does matter. And it matters in particular for the consumption rates. I didn't show that data, but it matters for consumption rates of these minor species, crab, oysters, mullet, and clams, and a much stronger affinity for wild products on the coast. Right? So people on the coast care more that it's wild than Raleigh or Asheville or other places that were captured in the survey. So my second to last slide. Last question. We asked people, what are the most important considerations for managing mariculture? I ask you to think about that too. What should we be managing for? Right, we've got this new industry. We want to grow it, or the state wants to grow it. But what should the objectives of that management be? And which are the most important? Right? These are all objectives that either appear in North Carolina legislation or at more national initiatives or have come up in the conversations that we've had. And so we presented respondents with these choices. And these are the kinds of things that they tell us. By far the most important are two things: protecting small and family businesses, who benefits, and that it be environmentally sustainable. Some of these other things that are emphasized by the state, like including this one, are not unimportant, but less important for many of the respondents. So I'll leave you with this for Seacoast, for thinking about resilience and adaptation. I've already shared those first four ideas about why I think culture is important when we're thinking about impact and change, and we're thinking about what it is that people experience when a change happens, what they want to see in terms of an adaptation. Culture and values in particular are fundamental to that. Both consumers and producers hold a range of values that are relevant to the seafood transition that's going on, and both are under pressure. I didn't have time to talk about that today, but a combination of long-term changes, not just climate, but including climate, have changed the way that we fish in the ocean and also impinge on oyster aquaculture. And chronic impacts like hurricanes have also had some profound effects on the way that the industry is developing so far. But I'm going to stop there because I think I'm either over or close to my time, and open it up with what time we have remaining for questions.
Thank you, Grant. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. I don't see any in the chat, but Marty messaged me directly that he has a question. So Marty, go for it.
I can always ask the first question while everybody thinks of great questions. So one of the things that really struck me, this is really a great presentation, Grant, and I really appreciate all the details here. And as you know, these topics from a different methodological point of view are very near and dear to me. I noticed in some of the statements about people's values that there are also kind of interceding some claims that are factual in nature, or maybe contested facts. And so I wonder about how we think about this in the context of sometimes people make value statements, but say things that might not actually be true, and how you come to terms with that in terms of, what's what's being reflected. Is it reflecting misinformation, or is it reflecting true underlying values? So just wanted to toss that out there.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, it's a great question. We wrestle with that quite a bit. I didn't really get into this, but there's an understanding that beliefs and values sort of combine together towards shaping an attitude. What we believe to be true about a particular phenomenon, in this case, aquaculture, juxtaposed with the values we hold to be important, informs an attitude towards that thing, towards aquaculture in this case. So we did want to include a mix of both value and belief statements in that concourse, so we could say something about attitudes as well. And they are beliefs. They are not truisms. They are what people, when we interview them, that we talk to them, that we hear from them, that's what they state as their perception of truth. And yeah, that's problematic when it comes to policy implications at the end. Do you deal with the beliefs that people have and say, well, okay, that's actually wrong, so what our need then is some form of environmental education or outreach to sort of correct that misunderstanding? Or is it, well, that's what people believe to be true, and so we're going to message in a way that sort of either avoids that problem or addresses that problem? And I don't have a clean answer for that. It's a challenge in the method of, do we only stick to the facts as we know it as scientists, or do we address the beliefs that are present in the community, informing that the way that they are valuing and understanding the world around them? So there's a definite tension there. You know, there's an interesting tension there, because we talk about, one of the questions that we asked, not in this survey, but in an allied one, was where people get their information about aquaculture, because we were interested in, okay, you know, how do they know, come to understand what they think they know about the industry? And by far, the most important is word of mouth, right? They talk to other people. They talk to their neighbors. They talk to their community. They talk to their, you know, their sort of cultural conspecifics, if that's a word, right? You talk to the people that you know and that you trust. And so if that belief is there and it's recirculating within a community, they're not going to, you know, the Sea Grant website or the Duke website or to true sources. They're going to their neighbors. And so you have to address that.
Grant, I have a question about aquaculture, and this is going to show how little I know about it. With the growth of aquaculture, what is the job market like? Is it displacing typical fishing jobs, or is there migration away or to other communities?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of the sort of the salesmanship around the growth of aquaculture is that it'll provide opportunities for coastal communities, and in particular displaced fishers. Fishing industry is not increasing. In fact, it's in a lot of fisheries in North Carolina is either plateaued or is stagnating. And so, okay, well, fishers will relocate from fishing to aquaculture. And it's a little early to tell whether or not that's going to happen, but looking to other states like Maine, it doesn't happen. Most fishers do not want to be farmers, right? And so we had one question, a statement in there about, like, you know, fishing is like this adventure. Remember, I had that thing about searching and independence and the hunt and those beliefs and values that people associate with fishing. They're not like aquaculture. They're not, you know, this static, non-mobile production farming techniques for people. And so there's competition for fishers. Some of them feel that there's competition. They're not going to take those jobs. Those aren't the jobs that they want. And they're producing the same food that they're trying to sell in the same markets. And so that creates some, you know, antipathy there, that people don't want to see what they don't see as a viable option for themselves, displacing what little left they have in terms of their livelihoods. Now, that's one set of viewpoints. Others see it as, well, I don't care if my kids or the wider community is fishers or aquaculturalists. I just want to have a healthy community. I just want to see people stay here and take the jobs, whatever jobs that they want. So it kind of depends on, you know, who you talk to, a displaced fisher or somebody more interested in the community as a whole.
Okay. Norbert, I see your hand up.
Thank you. And great presentation, Grant. And given some of the things I've done in the past and some work that I've read, I find this approach really fascinating. And I'd say it this way: what I loved about what you're presenting is the complexity of the values that people carry when they think about fisheries, aquaculture, how people are dealing with this. And it's not clean, it's messy, it's sort of this complex thing. And I know one of our colleagues, a guy named Jason Lusk, has done some work with food and looking at food values. And he uses a technique called best-worst scaling. And it's similar to choice experiment. And so one of the things that you can sort of in that world is force people to say, I like this, or I hate this. And it is sort of, if you will, cleans things up. But of course, that then leads us into this, either you're for it or against it. And your world is showing, well, actually people are somewhere in between. And I guess I'm asking a question of how should we really think about, as researchers, this world of the way that people have, oh, sorry.
Yeah. Norbert, you froze for me. Can you just repeat the last phrase that you said?
Yeah, sorry about that. My question is, how should we think about how people carry sort of conflicting ideas as researchers, knowing that they have this mix of things going on in their head, but sometimes, like you talked about, even with policy, you really want to force people into very narrow spaces so you can assign a policy, address that particular concern. Uh-oh, did I freeze again?
No, I actually think Norbert or Grant's freezing.
Grant might be having
Sorry.
some internet. That's a really great question. Great question.
Yeah.
Norbert,
No,
I lost a lot of what you said. I'm sorry, you were freezing for me.
Oh, Grant, you're freezing for me. Well, you know what? We will have this conversation later.
I'm sorry.
I think that is a fantastic question to end on today. This idea of, we can't have a continuity of policies, right? We can't have infinite policies to address infinite complexity. And we have to have a narrower set of possible policies. So how do we deal with the incredible complexity of people's preferences and a finite policy menu? It's a wonderful question. And I think it's exactly the sort of interaction that we're trying to get on Seacoast and in Disciplines 101. So thank you, Norbert, for the ending with the question, even if Grant's internet went out, except that he's back now. So did you want to try it, or should we just end there?
Well, I only heard Marty's recap of it, but I understand the spirits behind how do you deal with this complexity of values and beliefs and sort of internal contradictions within communities, and the fact that we need to govern these spaces and we need to make choices about policy priorities and so on. Yeah, for sure. That's a tension on this. I mean, I would argue that local governance control over things like seafood production is important because of that complexity. Can we devolve decision making to a point where those most affected by it can have the most agency in the decisions that affect them. And some states have done that. Massachusetts has devolved authority over shoreline aquaculture to much more municipal levels of governance. Others have not, like North Carolina, that we make decisions at the state level. And so, there's a disconnect between this complexity and who gets to decide about that.
All right, well, we are now officially over time. So I just want to thank Norbert and Grant for outstanding presentations, and thanks everyone for joining us. We'll have another D101s coming up in 3 weeks, I think, 3 weeks. And thank you all.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks again, Marty. Thanks. Bye.